So welcome everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I'm probably not going to stand behind this because then I'll feel trapped in, but I hope you can hear me as I wander up and down. Some of you may have been here earlier on when Peter and Caroline were talking about the book, which I'm sure is a fantastic book, and they talked about chief data officers coming from different places, and they mentioned four. So people coming from strategy, from regulation, from data science, and sometimes from other parts of the business. So the irony of that, and it may become more relevant later on, is that in addition to being HMRC's chief data officer, I'm also HMRC's chief economist. So it's not obvious that you make a pathway from being chief economist to chief data officer. And what you'll find is it gives us a slightly different way of thinking about this problem as we go. Now, what I want to share with you this afternoon is a little bit of a scale of the organization that I work in, a bit about the size of the transformation that we're undergoing and how that fits with our overall strategy. And then I'll say a little bit about what our data strategy is all about. And then finally I'll end by saying a few things that I think are really relevant for inside an organization of this size for making this a success. So first of all, size of the organization. So 575 billion pounds of revenue flows through the organization last year. So you wouldn't say it was turnover, but it's a fair whack of revenue that we have to manage each year. We've got 60,000 staff that do that, 5 million business customers and 45 million individual customers. So to give it a bit of a sense of scale, it's a fairly big, complex organization. So one of the largest IT and data estates in the UK, so 600 systems, 500 terabytes of data, over only the 5,000 servers. So you can imagine that the role sitting at the center of this is reasonably complex and keeps me from getting into any mischief. So as an organization though, what's our objectives? You know, and these are written in our speak. So maximize revenues due and bear down on avoidance and evasion. So this is the sort of thing that you'd like us to be doing, right? You'd like us to be making sure that, you know, the revenue that's due gets collected, and those that choose not to bring it to us, we find out. The second part though is transform tax and payments for our customers is quite important, and I'll unpack these in a minute. Because this is about, in lots of ways, a lot of your organizations probably thrive on customer contact. Because the more customer contact that you're having, the better it is for the organization, the more information you're gathering. The more information you're gathering, the more data you're gathering, and the more data you're gathering, the more insight you're getting. So think about it as we're going to come back to sort of income tax self-assessment customers in a minute, who file once a year. And if they want to contact us, probably better not, right? Because it means that something's gone amiss. We'd probably prefer less contact, not more. So in an organization like that, the challenge for us getting the data together and then getting the insights of that data is not insignificant. But we need to transform these. And then the final bit is about us looking inward, right? So what you would want from a tax authority is a fairly professional outfit that's well organized and well drilled and isn't, you know, if we're collecting your money, you wouldn't want us wasting any of it along the way. Oops, I've gone a bit too fast. So let me say a little bit more about what that means. So 8 key decisions driving through the organization. All of them, as you'll see, underpinned by what it is that we need to think about and organize and manage and deliberate from our data. So the first of these 3 falls under this heading of maximizing revenue. The first one is focus on our customers. I'm sure you've been to lots of talks, and I'm sure you've seen some fantastic tools out there that is about segmenting customers. So this is really about thinking our customers in important segments, like the wealthy and mid-sized businesses, like the largest businesses in the United Kingdom. Like, how do we deal with individuals? Because if we've got 45 million individual taxpayers, well, we'd like to be able to think and make sure that we tailor those services accordingly. The bit about promoting compliance and preventing non-compliance. So this is quite straightforwardly the Treasury. You may wonder how it is that the Chief Economist from HMRC gets to be here today when the budget's next week. We won't be able to discuss that. But so the budget's next week, and the Treasury get to deliberate on tax policy. We get to deliberate on, once that tax policy is developed, how do you design how you put that into place? It's because we manage the process. So in a perfect world, yeah, so you've got your product designers and your marketing people all doing great things and telling you, here's a great product. So then you've got your people inside manufacturing thinking, well, how am I going to put this together? So you think about that's us. What we want to be able to do is design a system and design a product and design a process that for the vast majority of taxpayers gets them through the organization seamlessly. That's what that's about. It's also about, if you're likely to make a straightforward error, can we use our data and our insight to help you to not make that error before you get anywhere near us? Because the last thing we want is us misconstruing that error for something that was done deliberately and then wandering around. It's nice to have us visit, I'm sure, but actually most people would probably rather not. But where we have to, you deal with we'd rather be preventing any non-compliance happening in the first place. And that's where the data insights come into play. Then the final bit is reducing the likelihood of disputes. So it's an inevitable part of the world in which we operate. Disputes will arise over the way in which tax is done. So our objective here is to minimize that, partly through the stuff I've just talked about, but partly through making sure that we use kind of litigation. We're going to court only where we need to, and then we're using other tools at our disposal. And that's the way in which we would say maximizing revenues. What it really means is getting the £575 billion that should be coming in. The second part of it is transforming tax and payments. And you'll see in a moment how data flows all the way through this. But the first of these is digital tax accounts. I'm going to come on to those in a minute because we've got two up and running, personal tax accounts and business tax accounts. And what this is really about is a way, much easier way, in which everybody can interface with us. So everything is now online. I'm willing to bet that the last time I've changed my address with my bank, I've probably moved 3 or 4 times, and this is a quite relevant anecdote because everything is online and I've taken my statements paperless, and therefore I no longer need to do anything with them, right? So I've moved house 3 or 4 times. Well, when last did I tell them I changed my address? A quite relevant story if you're trying to get the customer data right. So, but this is about how do we get those tax accounts right to deal with them. The second bullet here is about supporting intermediaries, and this is the bit that's really interesting. So we generate, personally, probably very, very little data, because almost all of the data that we've got is third-party data. It either comes from employers sending us data, or it comes from vendors sending us VAT data, or it comes from you submitting your tax returns, or it comes from businesses submitting their tax returns. It's not data that we're writing down and making ourselves. So the important thing here is for us to think quite hard about how do we work with those intermediaries, whether it's banks or agents or employers, partly to get the data right, but partly to make sure that we get everything else right along the way. Part of the tax system, an important part of the tax system is the role of agents. So agents play an important role in helping people to get it right, and where they do, our job is to make sure that we're supporting them. And at the same time, also helping them to make sure that they're giving the right kinds of advice. So that's the third one there. Then the final bit is making sure that we're professionally engaged organization. So this is about making sure we build our own skills, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment, and then make sure that we're also delivering for government. So if you think about this in a more holistic sense, and I'll mention some more about this momentarily, but in a holistic sense, so we're one of the biggest departments there is. So therefore, we have quite an important responsibility to how we use our data resources also for a wider government purpose. So if you think about the interaction between ourselves and sort of the Department for Work and Pensions, there's quite a strong interaction, both between our data and also in where we might have joint sort of operations, ourselves and Home Office, ourselves and all sorts of other places. So I wanted just to say something about the data that's flowing through our systems. So I mentioned the digital tax account. The business tax account's got 2.8 million users last year, and it was used 11 million times. The personal tax account was accessed 38 million times by the 12.6 million users. Now that's gone from, that was a new service sort of 2 or 3 years ago, and it's now got 12.6 million people using it. Now the interesting bit about our organization, when we continue to talk about sometimes this big data and we talk about velocity and volume and value and so on, is thinking about what happens over our self-assessment peak. So we had 3.2 million users in the personal tax account in January, 207,000 of them on the 31st. So in one day we had 207,000 users accessing this. The kind of information about the number of concurrent parts that we're processing at that time is quite phenomenal. Then the second part of this that I wanted to mention is we've got a system that's well known called Connect. And what Connect does is it drives a lot of our risk analysis. So by our risk analysis we mean about taxpayer data. It holds in it something like 22 billion lines of data, both on our kind of taxpayer records and third-party data. There are over 4,000 users across our organization. And sort of since 2010, that leveraging the information and data we've got in that system, we've brought in something like £4 billion worth of additional receipts. When we move to debt, and there's an important part about why this breaks like this in these ways, we move to debt. So 44.3 billion pounds of debt was collected by HMRC last year. The analytics system that we own and run, so again, 25 billion rows of data, processing something like 10 million transactions a day. So this system then feeds all our operational work right across the country for where people need to go. And the important part that you'll recognize in all of that is how I'm able to sort of do this information in these three important silos, because they're three kind of different activities that go right across the organization. I'll mention a bit more about that in a moment. So, if data really is the new oil, there's no value to it being in the ground, right? So the task for us, all of us, I think, is to make sure that we've got the infrastructure in place and we know where the oil is. There's a bit of prospecting that we've got to do to get this. You've got to get the factories out to add the value, right? The oil's no good unless it's either in our cars as petrol or in the plastic toys that we no doubt are going to spend a lot of money on soon. And we've got the right skills to exploit it. So if we take that as our premise, our overall approach to thinking about our data-centered strategy is this. So we've organized it, and the important thing about it is it's all about capabilities. So we think about it as being, what are the core capabilities that an organization of 60,000 people processing something like 575 billion pounds worth of revenue every year needs to have? So the important bit is let's set the foundations right. And we start with thinking through, so what does our enterprise data model need to look like? And I would often describe this as about, well, we're in the house and we're now trying to decide, well, I want a new architecture for this house, but I still need to live in it. And I'm going to put this new architecture in place while I'm going to move from the kitchen to the bathroom to the bedroom and so on, because in lots of ways you can put in a new enterprise data model, but we're not going to start from scratch. So we're going to gradually get there as we put all of this into place. The second, and this is fundamentally important for us in our organization, because there is nothing more important. Well, there must be something more important, because if ever somebody's had to say that, there must be something more important than this. But it's absolutely central to what we do to make sure that we protect the integrity of the data that we hold. So that 575 billion pounds, most of it flows because people trust the tax system. So most of it flows also because you trust what we do with the data that flows. And that only really works if we've got proper governance in place. So we spend an enormous amount of time thinking through quite hard how it is that we govern and use properly the data that's flowing through the organization. Whether it's the coming in through the personal tax accounts and what the activity is that's happening on the personal tax accounts, the returns that we get into the organization, the returns that we then use to try and select through this Connect system for compliance work that we might do, or how it is that we're collecting debt. Holding, managing securely, safely that data is absolutely fundamental to what we do. Now, we've got in the center here this thing of master data management, and again, I'm sure you've been out to lots and lots of stalls out here where everybody's saying, well, this is how we're doing master data management. And the piece that you'll have noticed from earlier in our transformation program is all customer-centered. And being all customer-centered, coming from an organization where actually you make tax policy by tax, and you do tax collection by tax. So the important part of what we're transitioning to is bringing that tax data and bringing our activity data, whether it's debt or customer contact, towards being around genuinely customer-centered. So that when you're interacting with us, both you get a chance to be able to see this is what my entire interactions with HMRC are, and similarly, we as an organization across the 60,000 people don't feel like we're in different silos and different pockets. And that's quite important to us. And the only way in which we can do that is, first of all, by making sure that we fully understand how your data flows through, and second of all, that we've got the right kind of tools, technology, governance, processes in place to see how that data is flowing through our organization. So a central building block. Data quality, absolutely crucial, right? So whatever the apocryphal numbers are about how much time data scientists spend cleaning data before they can even get started on their favorite project. So two elements of this for us. So starting from the premise I said that we're not making this data ourselves. We're either getting it from everybody in the room, or we're getting it from employers, or we're getting it from third parties, and to which we don't necessarily are able to govern what your data standards are, or what their data standards are. So the important actual piece of work for us is making sure that the quality of the data that flows in, and then the way in which we manage it through the organization, is absolutely tip-top. Because the degree to which it's not, the harder it becomes for us to bring it all together and give everybody in the UK that customer-centered approach to how we manage the tax returns. So that's pivotal. And then the final thing is data acquisition. So we acquire lots of data from a variety of sources, whether it's these third-party intermediaries or third-party data that we get from merchant acquirers, or data that we get from banks and building societies. And the important part of this element of it is twofold. So one is making sure that we prioritize and are absolutely clear, both ethically and operationally, that we get the data that we need, and we prioritize the data that we need, and we understand why it is that we're getting it, right? Because for whatever reason, whether it's GDPR or anything else, we need to be clear why it is that we're getting that data. And then secondly, having acquired it, very often, the important part about this data is making sure that we use it right across the organization, not just for a single purpose. So not just for whether it's collecting debt, but we also use it to improve the services that we are providing in the contact centers. So for me, those are the kind of foundations on which our strategy rests. Then you get to the next layer up, and I heard in one of the earlier discussions a quite important bit about how do we deal with building capability. 50,000 people, we have an organization in which those are our strategic principles I mentioned earlier on. You can see how data goes right the way through all of them, whether it's about building those customer segments, or building those digital tax accounts, or making sure that we've got the workforce in the right place with the right skills. So the important part of this building capability is at every single level. So whether you are somebody who's right on the front line, there's a piece of work for us to do to make sure that everybody understands their responsibility for using the data, the responsibility for using the data ethically, the responsibility for making sure that the data that is captured there is captured in a way that's consistent with the fact that we'll want to use it and reuse it. So there's a really key point for us there. Then the second piece I've got here about leaders and managers, and the reason that is important is this. So if you're in an organization yourselves that's at this sort of scale, well, if you've got 50,000 people, it turns out they all get managed. Some people prefer to be managed and some don't. But the reality is, if you think about our organization, and we've got sort of broadly 8 layers, and then everybody at the front line is, whether they're on a contact center or they're doing compliance work, is going to be managed in a team of 8 to 10. And they're going to be managed at that team of 8 to 10, and every time that, as you'll probably know, when you're doing things operationally, we're going to be trying to make this improve all the time. There's a level of productivity challenge that we get all the time, and important for our managers to understand their own numbers, and trust their own numbers, and trust where they are in terms of their delivery. When you get slightly higher than that, is where we want the organization thinking strategically about the data. So if you think about a level at which somebody might be managing a team of 100 or 200 people, what you're after is a slightly more complex way of understanding the data of delivery across that team, and being able to then connect that data across HMRC. So this is a capability build plan in which everybody who has access to the data trusts it, knows how to analyze it, and can handle it. Because if your job is about delivering operations, it's probably less likely that you spent a lot of time thinking about, well, how can I analyze data that allow me to think about, well, what happens if I stop doing this kind of activity and start doing this kind of activity? And then how do I manage my way through that process? Then the final piece that was there is about data sharing. And there is new legislation that allows us to share our data with other government departments. That seems to make an enormous amount of sense, whether it's about helping the ONS do national statistics better, or whether it's about helping us to drive service delivery. So this is a way in which what we would want to be doing here is handling as efficiently and as strategically as we can those data sharing requests. So that if we have a request to use some of our data, again, emphasizing the importance of that confidentiality that underpins everything that we do, while at the same time making sure that we get that data exploitation, get that data sharing stuff done right. And then of course all of this is, then you get to the top, right? And that's the cool stuff that we all keep talking about. And we all kind of go around lots of stalls, and when you go around lots of stalls, everything just is gee whiz, right? It all works straight away. Only works that way if all of the stuff that sits underneath is done well. You know, it only works well, and all the visualization only works well if all the stuff underneath is done absolutely to the highest level. But this is the bit where we are actively recruiting and building data science capability across the organization, where we're actively recruiting and investing in a whole range of different types of analysis, from even people like me who would want to use this data to drive out new insights about where the economy's going. Because if you think about the amount of information that we hold, right, driving out insights about where the economy's going is pretty important. And so bringing together a series of skills, whether they're operational research or economists or statisticians, with customer insight, is a value-added piece of work that we are doing to the organization. And then the thing with that is, well, that's got to be driving end-to-end transformation. So it's got to be answering the question such as the following. If you are shifting everybody onto digital tax accounts, or does that make any difference to these 570 billion pounds of receipts? It's got to answer questions right. If you're answering the phone and you can't get through on the phone, does that have any impact on downstream compliance? Might do if, like me, you were trying to change your address. So there are those sorts of questions where we're thinking at the center of the organization across the whole piece that says, how is it that you can use the data, you can exploit it, and get these insights to go through? Now, if that's the strategy, unfortunately you can't go to stationary in HMRC and get a magic wand and you can deliver it overnight. You have to deliver it incrementally over a series of transformation programs. So let me say a couple of things about what I think are going to be the key drivers of success. Now, anybody that was at the talk again earlier with Peter and Caroline would have seen them go through the stuff in the playbook, which is absolutely right. So getting some of the basics, to get senior sponsors. I've got a chief executive that wants to talk to me every other day about what we're going to do, and we get to go to the board next week and talk about the strategy, which is great, right? You've got to have a senior sponsor. You've got to have a clear vision from where you want to go. I think we're getting there. You've got to be able to communicate that vision to the organization. It's brilliant. You've got to have the strategy. You've got to get some quick wins. The organization is not going to wait for me to do the entire architecture, build a new house over here, while nothing else is happening, because it's transforming all the time. There's a big piece of delivery. You've got to build the capability in Alaska. You've got to get funding. You know, it is still important for us to get the funding. But I think those are the sorts of things that I just must do, right? They're right on my must-do list. So then when I go to the other side, I've got to think about, well, how am I going to make this actually work in practice in this size of organization? So the first one of these is quite important, especially if you're in an organization that's got a big hierarchy. So find the influencers and use them. Now, one of the earliest bits of, if you want to call it data science, that I ever saw was somebody doing network analysis of emails. And the reason they did network analysis of emails was precisely the following. They said, we're an organization, we are governed. So while you're an organization that's governed, everybody thinks that the hierarchy makes the decisions. So therefore you think it's your executive level that makes the decisions. In actual fact, it's the person through whom all the email traffic goes. Because they're the person that is always sought for advice. They're the person that's almost the filter on which everything goes. They're also the person in the organization that's telling everybody else, trust those data people. So there's something important about finding out who the influencers will be and where you're going to go. The second piece there is systems. So organizations this size are complicated. So it's not going to be linear, it's going to get churned into a system, and it's going to be a bit difficult. I think I've got about half a second left. The incentives piece is why it's important that I'm also the chief economist. So it's easy to get the high level influence. It's difficult if you're trying to get the rest of the organization to work with you to make sure that you've got the incentive structures right. If it's not in somebody's job description to make sure the quality of the data they put in is right, then they're not going to do it. It's as simple as that. You've got to think through what are the incentives that go through the organization. The second final piece is diversity. So it's a reasonably diverse group I'm seeing in front of me now. It's important that you get every voice heard when you're thinking about how you're going to use the data, because otherwise it's everybody just who looks like me. And I don't just mean people who look like me, I also mean people who think in the way that I do. That's no good for how we're going to exploit our data. And then the final thing I would say is humility. It's dead easy to get some flash data, and it's dead easy to do a proof of concept, and it's dead easy to go to the board with that and get them excited. But you've got to be humble with what you're going to do with the data. And you've got to be humble about what you're going to be able to achieve, otherwise it just all falls flat quite quickly. So that's it. Thank you very much for coming. I don't know if we've got time for questions. We may well do, but I'm happy to answer one. We may not. Okay, we've got one there and one here. And if it's about next week's budget, I can't answer it. Mainly because I don't know.
Just a quick question. What about engagement with customers? Because a lot of it is you're via agents and different people, but direct engagement with customers about the whole program.
Yeah. So about the data program, about the change program. So we certainly get lots and lots of feedback. We've got plenty of forums through which we do. So there are two or three things that are worth saying here. One is plenty of representative body forums through which we do this. We have an annual stakeholder conference at which we share all of the high-level strategy stuff. When we're designing a particular individual product, we have customer focus groups around which we're designing those. And then similarly, on the data pieces of it as well, we have exactly the same sorts of things, interaction directly with customers. Yep.
Thank you for this. It's really impressive, the diversity of sources that you're dealing with and the different levels of quality and integrity that needs to come into place. I'm just curious about, so you're rightly saying that the analytics and the visualization and all of these require very robust infrastructure underneath to work perfectly. And it's to do with the data model. So you have this master data model. Is that just a single one across all sources? Or do you split it to tiers to satisfy different types of analytics? How does it work?
So the first thing to say is very often we're really quite good at doing the analytics currently, either by individual product or by function. So if we're in debt, for example, we're reasonably strong with that. If you're in contact, we're reasonably strong with that. When we're unpacking the data model itself, to which we'll want to navigate, it's layered. So it's layered by what do we think that the customer data needs to look like, so the designatory data for that individual customer. Then it's layered by how do we think that relates to other sort of parties. And then there's a kind of model then that goes into by, if you want by product, how is it that then those products relate back to that customer? Yeah, so exactly. So effectively what you would want it to do is to layer up from the customer's designatory to the individual entities that are in that individual data that attaches to that customer, to then the interactions that we have operationally with the customer, to how it maps onto our own internal resources. Oh, there's one here.
Thank you for everything. I got really interested on the diversity fact.
Yep.
At what stage do you think it's important to have like diverse points of view or diverse team building? When gathering, when building, like, or just for the analysis? I don't know.
Yeah. So I think it's quite important to have it all the way through the data lifecycle, where even before you start the gathering, when you're asking the question, that's going to deliver the data, it's important to make sure that you're already there thinking about what are the right, sensible and correct questions to be asking. So to give you an example, some of the most complex parts of the tax system probably apply to the people that are least able to deal with it, right? And in doing that, you'll want to think quite carefully about how are you going to gather enough data to do the analysis so that then sensitively deals with where it is that you're going to be taking whatever kind of activity that is that you're doing. And will you always get that right? Probably not. But I genuinely think it starts here when you're asking the questions, as you're generating the data. And the bit that we lose sight of, I must be honest, not we personally, but generally in this community, is we seem to have forgotten to ask questions about the data generation process sometimes, because we're all busy getting in at the top end of the advanced analytics, wanting to get in amongst this data soup. We've got to think quite hard about how this data got here in the first place, because it's got the blind spots in. Then go through and ask, well, what kinds of questions are the right questions for us to ask with it? And then go through and then make sure that everybody gets a voice in how we're interpreting what's come out the other end. So I think it applies all the way across the life cycle. And it's not just the obvious characteristics of diversity that matter, it's the way we think as much as anything else. Cool. I think can we take one last one? Okay, we're going to have one, sorry.
Yes, I'm just curious to understand if there's an opportunity to use the data to drive legislation, for example, reduce tax avoidance and create new legislation to improve the sort of returns that people have to make.
Sorry, say that.
Will you use data to drive legislation, for example, reduce tax avoidance, improve the way people submit their data, for example, the rules around that?
Yeah, so so it goes back to the bit I was saying earlier on. We would almost constantly be using our data and the analysis and the insights that we get from our operational work to think through what's the best way for us to be tackling whatever it is that we are seeing in our tax gap that we published a week or so ago. So you start from that, and then in addition to that, you would want to be making sure that we use our data and our processes to think through what's the best way to design a new product that prevents any possibilities of avoidance further down the line. So yeah, absolutely, we use it all the time. Cool. Well, thank you all very much for coming, and I hope that was useful. Thank you.